we're about 9 months into the pandemic and about 3 weeks into the election-demic. As a 70-year-old guy, I'm starting to stagger under the cumulative accommodation pressure this year has placed on me. My 97-year-old grandmother saw the rise of the radio, the automobile, the television, the space program, mobile technology, and the internet, all in her lifetime. She lived through 2 world wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. She had all 4 of her sons and her son-in-law, my father, fighting in World War II at the same time. She was kind of our family's version of Saving Private Ryan. But I can tell you without hesitation that my grandmother never would have believed we could ever be where we are right now as a nation. Sometimes things seem to be spinning out of control. A lot of folks are skin-covered emotional IEDs, it seems. And there's a question simmering just below the surface in the minds of lots of people. I think especially people in the faith family. And that question is this it? Are we in the last days? Hi, I'm Fran, the host of this podcast, The Road to Shalom, an investigation into what the Hebrew word shalom means and implies, the mutual flourishing between all things, everything being the way it's supposed to be. Or in the words of God himself at the beginning of his meta-narrative, all things being very good. The problem is, they're not very good, that is. And this little show explores a bit why they're not and what it might take for shalom to be restored. And I titled this episode, the 9th one in our 2nd season, Are We in the Last Days? Partly because I'm getting asked that more and more. So as long as you're here, let's take a shot at providing an answer to that question. And I get to promise you right at the front end that if you stay with me to the end, you will have an answer to that question. But if I do my job right, it won't be the answer you thought you were going to get, but it will be the answer you need. Are you intrigued? I hope so. Okay. So I'm sitting in my office right now looking at the cover of a small booklet given to me 32 years ago when I was living in Colorado Springs. I figured it would come in handy someday, so I kept it all these years. It's printed with bright red lettering on the cover, and that stands out in stark contrast to the rather drab light beige trade paper that it's printed on. And when I tell you the title of the book, you'll know immediately why I kept it for 32 years. Are you ready? Oh, that's right. The title of the book. I'm sorry. The title of the booklet is 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. And the subtitle is even more intriguing. Here's the subtitle. The Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, September 11, 12, and 13. All right. So this author predicted that the rapture was going to be sometime between September 11th and 13th, 1988. And I don't think I need to say this, but just so we're on the same page, the event this booklet is talking about, the one that some theologians and Bible teachers call the rapture, beloved, it did not happen in mid-September 1988. I just want to make sure that you don't feel left behind, if you know what I mean. All right. So despite the fact that this little booklet is full of mathematical computations, testimonies from people in other countries who had visions and dreams about this exact moment, hundreds of Bible verses, and it was marinated. This booklet was marinated in passionate sincerity, all right? The author believed he was doing the American church an enormous service by helping her be ready to meet Jesus. He was convinced beyond conviction. He was willing to be a modern-day John the Baptizer, if that's what it took, and call the nation back to God. He was never in doubt. But of course, he was mistaken. People have an insatiable curiosity about the future, everything from stock market to college football playoff predictions. We even love futuristic movies like Interstellar, Minority Report, or even the kids' animation, Wall-E. And add to this that in the world of those who say they follow Jesus, the topic of the future is a veritable golden goose for books and movies. I mean, the 12-volume Left Behind series is a great example. I mean, we got 6,000 pages of dispensational, pre-tribulational theology dressed up as Christian fiction. The first volume emerged 7 years after 88 Reasons, all right? And that version of that first volume of Left Behind, it's still alive. In fact, a 25th anniversary edition of that first book, which had the title Left Behind, just came out this year. Christians seem to be drawn to the study of last things or end times, or as it's known among scholars, eschatology. And that makes perfect sense, I suppose. It not only deals with human history, but it's also centered on the return of Jesus Christ, what the Bible calls our blessed hope. Unfortunately, for some in the faith family, the journey from eschatology to some kind of version of Christian astrology is a really short one. So all of a sudden it becomes a portal into the future, which provides the same benefit as classical astrology, which is power over my destiny. It also, intentionally or unintentionally, tends to create two types of people: those who know and those who don't. I mean, those who are really in touch with what's going on, those who really know how to read the news, and those who don't. Those who see signs of the end, and others don't. And they see them because they have the secret insights that they've gained from studying Bible prophecy. 50 years ago, 1970, the year I came to faith, this was 18 years before 88 Reasons, all right? But in 1970, a book exploded on the scene called The Late Great Planet Earth, and it painted a very grim and rapidly approaching prediction about the future of humanity. It was a bestseller. That same decade, all right, I'm a brand new believer. That same decade, a couple of other books came out on the topic. One of them painted Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, a man named Henry Kissinger, as the Antichrist. Another claimed that the Universal Product Code, the UPC code, you and I would know it as the barcode that's on every single thing we have from avocados to hard drives, painted the UPC as the mark of the beast. And the so-called evidence was that on every UPC, every barcode contained 3 sixes, or 666, embedded in the barcode. One at the front, one in the middle, and one at the end. And if you look at any barcode, you will see 3 pairs of longer, thinner lines in it. One at the front, one at the end, and one in the middle. Unfortunately, though not surprisingly, these are called guard bars, and they're said to be 6s by the conspiratorialists, but they aren't. You can check that for yourself if you've got a barcode laying around that's got a real 6 in the number below the bar, and you can see that the number 6 isn't one of the guard bars, all right? But truth has never been an obstacle for some people, and that group among Christians is apparently growing. As a matter of fact, this idea about the UPC barcode Antichrist thing is still alive, and some Christians have somehow connected it to the barcodes that are related to the COVID-19 vaccine releases that are coming out. I share all these things at the front end because I want you to know that American evangelicalism has a very unillustrious history of getting nearly everything related to the end times wrong. And this shouldn't surprise us. Did you know that every time Jesus was asked a question about the end times or the last days, his response was the same? Honestly, it was the same. And first of all, he never answered the question right away. Okay? Do you know what he said instead? Do you know what his answer was when people asked him questions about the end times or the last days? Same answer every time. Take care that no one leads you astray. Take care that no one leads you astray. That was his answer when people asked him if they were in the end times or how would they know when it's coming, all right? And the word astray there, led astray, it's the same word used every time the story shows up in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. It means to wander away from the path. It means to get lost slowly. You know what this means? It means, beloved, that we have a propensity to get things wrong when it comes to the end times, and that there will be tons of people to help us lose our way. And as someone who's been watching the American church for 40 years, I'm here to tell you we really don't need any help in this area. We really don't. We seem to miss the point fine all by ourselves. So I'm going to suggest that if we're going to talk about whether or not we're in the last days, that we don't walk in the large front doors that many people of faith want to enter by. World events, key world leaders, economic indicators, what's going on with the nation of Israel. If you've been around me at all, it won't surprise you to discover that I'm going to take us into this convoluted question through a side door. not the front door, or the back door for that matter. Instead of following the classic formula of examining the world out there to find clues for our answer whether or not we're in the last days, we're going to start someplace else. You might be surprised where I'm going to begin. Unless you know me, then you won't be least bit surprised, all right? So, back to our question, the title of the episode, are we in the last days? Now, if you're in a hurry or you're parked in your driveway and realize you've got to make a choice, you either got to choose to turn off the car and miss the answer or stay in the car and miss dinner. Let me just give you the short answer. Short answer is yes, we are in the last days. But, don't quote me on that unless you listen to the rest of the episode, maybe sometime later, all right? How can I say that we're in the last days? Well, I don't really have an option because God says it. I'm just reposting something that was said in the AD 60s in an anonymous letter we call the book of Hebrews, or the letter to the Hebrews. It's in our New Testament. Here's how the letter opens. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. All right, did you hear that? In these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. The writer of Hebrews lays it right out there in front of us. The last days began with the coming of Yeshua. So yes, we are in the last days. Now you're probably thinking that's a cop-out. No, it's not a cop-out. The larger truth here is that with the arrival of God in skin, the incarnation, Yahweh taking on flesh, Yeshua the Messiah, all right, we stepped into the final chapter of God's plan for the fullness of time. The last days, beloved, began with the incarnation. Oh, we still are waiting for the return of the King, but it's not anything like the people in the Old Testament who had to get past David and about 20 other kings and then wait for the first and second arrival of the Messiah, all right? We're just waiting for the second one. We're way past where they were in history. We're in the last days. They were waiting for our day, all right? Now, having said that, the scriptures also make it clear that this last days thing that we're officially in is kind of like a thermometer. I mean, it's going to get more and more intense as the end of human history approaches. In other words, the last days that Jesus initiated aren't static. They're in motion because they're rooted in time, and time for us is always moving. It's moving forward. So in a very real sense, there'll come a time when we're actually in the last days of the last days. In fact, that's really what we mean when we banter back and forth about the end times. But beloved, there will also come what the Bible calls that day. That day when the curtains close on this life and we're ushered into what the Bible calls the life to come. All right, so you with me? Okay, let's come in that side door and talk a little bit more about the last days that we're in right now, okay? It's pretty easy to demonize the world right now. I mean, beloved, it's happening a lot. Some people seem to see it as a Christian career, and they're always eager to franchise their anger and criticism to anyone wanting to open up a shop of their own. And tragically, a lot of the demonization in our culture is coming from the keyboards and the mouths of evangelicals. That's another episode. But I do have 3 words I'd like to say about it before we move on. God have mercy. Okay. So what I want to do, rather than do a moral audit of the world around us to determine whether we're moving towards the last days of the last days, I want to look at us. I want to look at the church. I want to look at the people of God, or at least the group of us who claim kinship to Yahweh and Yeshua. Rather than looking at so-called evidence drawn from the moral decline of the culture, which, by the way, is easy to spot and even easier to condemn, we're going to dive into what the Bible has always said and says has happened or will be happening among God's people, among us, as the end approaches. I mean, what sort of things actually characterized God's people in the past, and or what sort of things were predicted to characterize God's people in the last days of the future? I'm absolutely convinced this, beloved, is the proper approach because of how many times we've gotten this wrong looking at the world instead of ourselves. Remember 88 Reasons? Remember that? Why rapture will be in 1988? That's why we're not coming in the front door where we present our Sunday best to the world. And we're also not coming in the back door where we hide our Monday worst from the world. We're coming in the side door, the one we hardly ever use, the door we don't expect anyone to come through, all right? So what does the Bible say characterizes our spiritual ancestors, all right, in their last days? And what will characterize us as the end approaches? And I'm going to spend our time doing that. I'll leave it up to you to decide if you know how far along the last days thermometer you think we are or might be, and which direction, honestly, you are moving the mercury. That's an important thing. So let's take a look at some last days that have already happened and see what God's people look like back then. Who knows? There might even be some similarities, all right? In our Old Testament, the guys who had the unfortunate and highly unpopular task of telling God's people the truth about themselves when they were drifting somewhere between losing the plot and losing their minds, they were called the prophets. And the two times in the history of God's people when their last days, in fact, showed up were at the end of the northern kingdom of Israel and at the end of the southern kingdom of Judah. Like I said, we are not following the classic model. We're not going to even talk about Assyrian paganism and cruelty or Babylonian idolatry. We're not looking to the world, all right? Not looking to the world for our clues. We're looking to the family of God. We're looking into our own family album. Then we're going to look into the family mirror near the end of this episode, all right? The prophets tasked with assessing the condition of God's people during their last days were Amos and Hosea for the northern kingdom and Jeremiah, Micah, and Ezekiel for the southern kingdom. You don't need to know all those names. This podcast isn't a quiz, but there is a test. God is testing his people right now, beloved. And I need to tell you, it's pass-fail, okay? That's another podcast. All right, so what can Amos and Hosea tell us about what God's people look like when their last days showed up? Well, there's some heavyweight sins like human trafficking and sexual looseness, but there were also some things that were less visible and therefore more easily dismissed. Things that would easily go under the radar, unnoticed, or worse, would simply be incorporated into the fabric of spiritual life and become part of the worldview of God's people because more and more of them thought that way. And so that must be the truth. If everyone's talking the same way and thinking the same way, surely that must be the truth. Sort of the ancient version of modern social media news feeds that are tailored, right, to reinforce what you already think rather than inform you so you know how to think. One of the things that characterized God's people during the days of Hosea and Amos was they kept getting angry with their preachers. If they preached anything about what was wrong with them, what was wrong with God's people, they simply weren't having it. Don't talk to us about us. Preach and prophesy about them, about Babylon, about Assyria, about Syria, about Egypt, about Moab, about Edom. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. They continued with all their worship services, their tithing, their singing. They wanted church life to go on just as normal. They also wanted to live their lives of personal leisure and political safety. But the prophets called them out for leaving Yahweh out of their thinking. Now, how did the prophets know they had wandered from the truth? I mean, how did the prophets know? Well, they neglected the poor in their midst. Okay, I'm guessing that for some of you, your liberal theology light is flashing amber right now, all right? Let me clarify a couple of things about the poor and the needy in the Old Testament. First of all, they were not social problems to be solved. They were people groups to be cared for, all right? God expressed profound anger towards his people when they neglected the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the refugee. Now, why? Was it because God was a socialist? Was it because God was a Democrat? No, it was because neglecting these people, I want you to hear me here, neglecting these people was evidence of unfaithfulness to him. Caring for the poor was God's barometer for covenant faithfulness. Beloved, their neglect of those four people groups, widows, orphans, refugees, and the poor, proved to God that they were not interested in following him, knowing him, loving him, or obeying him. Now, how can I possibly say this? Because all the things they weren't doing and all the people they were neglecting, God had given clear instructions about it in the law. The fact that they weren't doing those things proved that they either weren't familiar with God's word, or worse, were choosing to ignore him. What was God's description of his own people as they approached their last days? How did he describe them? Well, he accused them of resembling the people outside his covenant family more than him. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a new thing, but I told you we're coming in the side door here, all right? Beloved, God's concern was never that his people would become Canaanites. He wasn't worried about that. His concern was that they would become Canaanite Jews. Did you hear that? His concern was not that they'd become Canaanites. It was that they would become Canaanite Jews, that they'd become like the people around them, but still go through the motions that made them look and sound like his people. And Yahweh tells us what this looks like at the end of the northern kingdom. Listen to his description of what happened to his people and their behavior. Here's what he says. Even while these people were worshiping Yahweh, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their fathers did. Did you hear that, beloved? This is profound. It means that God isn't as concerned about who we worship or who we say we worship. He's concerned about who we are serving. Who has our allegiance? Who has our hearts? Oh man, their worship was moving right along as usual. But Yahweh saw it differently. He said this. He said, this people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. They had, in the words of the Apostle Paul, the appearance of godliness. The appearance of godliness. And beloved, let me throw this out right here. I don't think this particular concern of God's about his people, I don't think it's changed. I think he's still concerned about the exact same thing for us. God is concerned that you and I will become like our culture more than like our Savior. That you and I will slowly become American Christians rather than Christians who happen to live in America. That we become people who are more shaped by Wall Street and the flag than by the Scriptures. Beloved, the pull of culture never ceases. In fact, what happens is that it becomes less noisy and less visible. It becomes ambient and transparent. And for God's people in the Old Testament era, rather than being distinct within the surrounding culture's values slowly became their own, all the while thinking they were enjoying the blessing of God. And beloved, because we tend to chase what we value and become like what we chase, they became Canaanite Jews. Another thing they did that angered God was that they rejected him as their king. I mean, not publicly, of course, but there was a genuine transfer of trust from Yahweh to political power, from the unseen God to the very visible world of men and politics. They pursued political choices that allowed them to continue their lives as Canaanite Jews, lives of personal peace and affluent freedom. They trusted in the power of politics to protect them, and Yahweh called them out on it. He said this, "And now what do you gain by going to Egypt to drink the waters of the Nile? Or what do you gain by going to Assyria to drink the waters of the Euphrates? How much you go about changing your way, you shall be put to shame by Egypt, just as you were put to shame by Assyria." And they did a couple other things. They supported the kinds of people to rule over them who would keep their lives comfortable rather than lead them back to Yahweh. And true to form, Yahweh calls them out on this too, through his servant Hosea. He said this, "They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not." You know, just before Israel in the north last days, their economy was the strongest in its history. They had become intoxicated by a booming economy. And God tried to warn them, to no avail, but he tried to warn them about the corrosive and destructive power of affluence and leisure. When he said to them, again through the prophet Hosea, "When I fed them, they were satisfied. When they were satisfied, they became proud. Then they forgot me." Those were the last days of the northern kingdom of God's people. Do you see any similarity there between then and now? Okay, the last days of Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, were 150 years after the last days of the northern kingdom, but they were very similar. This time, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, major prophets, were tasked with confronting God's people to examine their own hearts instead of being distracted by the upheavals on the global political stage. All right? Babylon and Assyria were fighting, and it eventually was going to be Babylon and Persia. But Babylon had come to power when Anne was coming to town. And one thing God highlighted about his people during this second version of the last days had to do with where they got their information, who they were listening to, how they were deciding how and what to think, and therefore what to do. Here's what Yahweh told Jeremiah. And you shall say to them, this is the nation that did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, and did not accept discipline. Truth has perished. It is cut off from their lips. Do you hear that? Truth has perished. It is cut off from their lips. Beloved, truth became distasteful. Then it became disposable. And finally, it became disassociated and marketable. Whoever was the loudest and the most flamboyant garnered the largest following in Jeremiah's day. I mean, listen to the heart of Yahweh in this regard. Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far off. For truth has stumbled in the public squares, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. The Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. You know, Yahweh told his people that when truth stumbles in the public square, uprightness is also barred from entering, and injustice begins to flourish as a result. This is what happens when the truth of God is not valued, it is not taught, and it is not obeyed among God's people. It's one of the characteristics of the conditions before the last days of God's people in the past. Beloved, make no mistake. Make no mistake. Truth is foundational to life, both private life and corporate life. And for those of us in God's family album, truth is found in His Word. And I'm not talking about isolated verses here and there in the Bible. I'm not talking about a verse a day keeps the devil away. I'm talking about the redemptive narrative of Scripture, the entire narrative of Scripture, God's plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in heaven, things on earth in His Son. You know, when God's people lose the plot, they lose their way. And when they lose their way, they follow the crowd because it at least appears to be going somewhere. And if that many people are all headed in the same direction, well, surely it must be the right way to go, right? Okay, so it looks like God's family, our spiritual ancestors, had a little difficulty finding their spiritual and moral compass, and their last days came and went. So did their kings and their kingdoms. But that's the past. Do we have any insight about what we might look like in our modern era if our own last days might be on the horizon? Well, in fact, we do. The Apostle Paul, writing in the last quarter of the first century, spoke of a future last days and gave us a very clear description of what would characterize believers in those last days of the last days. Now, disclaimer here at this point. I'm not giving you 21 reasons why Jesus will return in 2021, but I am laying before you God's description of what will characterize His people, at least a bunch of them, all right, in the, quote, last days. Where these last days fall on our last days thermometer, I have no idea. But it's a whole lot sooner than it was when Paul wrote it, right? And even more important, because we have our ancient cousins to learn from, it seems pretty stupid of us to make the same mistake. I mean, don't you agree? Okay, let's listen to Paul, or rather, let's listen to Yahweh through Paul's pen. But understand this, that in the last days, there will come times of difficulty, because people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people. Okay, that's Yahweh's description of the character of many who have the appearance of godliness in the last days, all right, that hadn't arrived yet in the days of Paul. These last days, according to Paul, were still in the future. And to be clear, I'm not trying to nail down when Jesus is returning, but I am trying to lay open before us what God has told us in advance will characterize people within the faith community in the last days. I'm not interested in the calendar event here. I'm concerned about the condition of the American church, something I've been speaking and writing about for 40 years. All right, so let's step into this. Paul, or rather God again, by the force of the verb here, tells us, he says, understand this. When he tells us understand this thing is something we're supposed to do all the time, according to the force of the verb. It's a command with no end. In other words, we have to keep on getting this right. It's not an insight. It's not a little blip. It's an outlook. And it starts with the realization and perhaps even a reminder for us believers that the last days aren't going to be a carnival cruise. In fact, I sort of get a kick out of the way the translators of the ESV rendered the Greek word kalapas in Paul's comment. They tell us there will be times of difficulty. Understand this, that in the last days there will be times of difficulty, all right, for chalapas. The NIV gets a little closer translating chalapas this way. There will be terrible times in the last days. Another translation puts it perilous. But the ESV, difficult? Really? I mean, did you know that this is the same word that was used to describe the demon-possessed guy running around naked in a graveyard in Matthew's gospel? There it's translated violent. I mean, picture this guy on a talk show being interviewed about what it was like to be demon-possessed, running around naked, cutting yourself with stones, breaking chains, living in a graveyard. And the guy responds, "Oh, it was difficult." Beloved, the last days are going to be times of fierceness, times of great stress. They're not just a little difficult, okay? And Paul says, keep telling yourself this. Keep reminding yourself this. Fierce times are ahead. But what do you think Paul's talking about here? The economy, the environment, the incompetence of national leaders? Well, he tells us, because the very next word is an explanatory word. It's the word for or because. Paul says, here's the reason times are going to be fierce. Here's what you should be remembering to look out for. And the reason is the next word, people. People. It's a generic Greek word for people, but the reason things are going to be difficult in the last days is because of people. What kind of people? Well, thankfully, Paul seems to be anticipating that question because he spends the next 4 verses describing those people. And I want to jump to the end and then come back and sprint through the specifics. Near the end of this list of 20 characteristics, Paul says this, that these people having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Did you hear that? Did it have a little Old Testament echo to it? Now, I'm not going to die for this next statement. I might be willing to get beat up for it, but it has enough truth to it to cause us to pause. The word appearance here, the appearance of godliness, refers to the outward life, the profession, the image projected. All right? Godliness, the Greek word for godliness, speaks of religion or piety or just religion in general. All right? In short, these are not secular people that Paul's talking about. And the word power that he uses here, denying the power of it, holding a form of godliness but denying its power, is a broad word that encompasses everything from authority to strength to miracle. Beloved, these are religious people. These are people professing piety and connection to God, but these are also people who've cut themselves completely off from the power and authority of God. These are modern versions of Canaanite Jews. These are religious people whose lives are more defined by their surroundings than by God. And Paul ends this section by telling this young pastor, Timothy, to teach his church folks to avoid people like this. Why? What in the world are these people like that would cause Paul to say this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because he lists 20 characteristics so that we wouldn't miss it. All right. Now, I'm going to go through some of them. We're not going to go through all 20. All right. You heard me read them just a minute ago, but let's look at them again. Let me just throw out a few on the table. Lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, swollen with conceit, heartless, and treacherous. Now, we don't have time to do justice to this, but let me just tell you that of the 20 descriptors that Paul uses, nearly half of them are words describing something that is missing from the person. For instance, heartless is a word that means without natural love for people. The word brutal is a word that means without civility or tameness. All right, that word implies a savageness and a fierceness. These people are unloving and uncivil in their dealings with other people. But the family of words that dominate this list have to do with arrogance, pride, and conceit, an attitude of superiority, an inflated view of self-importance. The words behind our English words, the Greek words behind them, points to a loud boasting, a projection of being above others, and kind of living in a cloud of self-importance. And beloved, the real danger here is not that it's wrong, even though it is. The real danger, a sobering danger, is that this attitude of arrogant, boastful, verbal pride, I want you to listen to me here, causes God to be against us. He opposes us. I'm not sure what you think about God having sides, but I can tell you without doubt or hesitation that God has settled this issue once and for all. Both James and Peter affirm this when they tell us God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Beloved, God is against the proud. It's not that he's just not on their side. He's against them. And this is true whether you're a plumber, a preacher, a physician, or a president. So when you look around you right now, how would you describe the popular expression of Christianity that America is watching? If you're on social media, how would you characterize the posts, reposts, tweets, and retweets made by Christians? Would you say what you're seeing is characterized by the things God says he cares about? Is what you're reading and hearing known for its truth? Is it known for pledging its allegiance to the kingdom of God? Is it known for its care for the widow, the fatherless, the refugee, and the poor? Is it known for its civility? Is it known for its humility? Is it known for its beauty? Is it known for its ability to listen? Or is what you read and hear known for its hostility, its conspiracy, its allegiance to a political party, its love of self, its love of financial security, its boasting, its excess passion, and absence of truth? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, which of these two groups are you a part of? Which of these two groups are you making your contribution to? How much of what God values is at the center of what you say, what you write, what you post, what you repost? What portrait of God are you painting before the watching and reading world? Are the characteristics of the last days of God's people in the past visible in our current hour? Unfortunately, yes. Are the characteristics Paul told us to look for in the last days that he predicted present in our current hour? Unfortunately, yes. Beloved, make no mistake, the last days are coming. They have been on their way since the first Christmas. Are they here now? I have no idea. But as someone who has reluctantly wore the mantle of prophet longer than I have wished, I will not shrink from saying that the behavior of God's people that characterized the last days of Israel and Judah, and the behavior that Paul predicted would characterize the last days that are more last than those previous, that behavior is surely in our midst. To deny it is to be asleep. To say nothing is to be unfaithful. To contribute to it is unconscionable. I suspect this episode didn't help your eschatology, but perhaps it helped clarify your fealty. If it did that, even a little,